So on to today, the freeing power of forgiveness. So anyway, on to step 8 of our theme this year is to be a vessel for transformation, and we've been combining the 12 steps of AA, the 12 spiritual promises, as well as the 12 spiritual principles of New Thought, and the 12 action steps, spiritual action steps of New Thought, to assist us in growing and improving and increasing our awareness and in healing anything that we are carrying with us that does not support us to our highest and best good. So last week we began step 8 by looking at what it takes to make a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. And I'm almost 100% positive that everyone that was here last week went home, got out their list, and wrote it out. And you got that baby all done. And if you didn't, what I want you to look at is, does this only apply to them? You know them. They're the ones that you're always worried about how they'll see you, how they'll respond to you. You don't know who them are, but you're just concerned about them. Them. The power of them. So I want to make sure that what I've been concerned with from the beginning of the year is that are we doing this stuff, or do we keep thinking it only applies to others? And so that's what we've been looking at. And one of the sermons was around our pride. Our pride is one of the biggest deterrers. Is that the word I want? Deterrent, that's right, deterrent from preventing our healing from taking place. And that's that ego that gets in the way. And I'll keep using that term because I want you to remember the acronym for ego is edging God out. And in our hesitancy to heal or to free ourselves from anything that is holding us back from being our highest and most powerful self, the thing that keeps us from doing that is our ego. So we want to look at then, and I've loved when I discovered this word kenosis, the Greek word for emptying of the mind, emptying of ourselves, of anything that needs to be emptied that is not supporting us to our highest and best good in our life. And so what we've been focusing on this year is looking at any of our habits, our behaviors, or to the extreme addictions that when we're practicing them, they are not reflecting our magnificence of self, or they do not reflect our magnificence into others' lives. So we're looking at, is there anything in there that needs a little bit of shift or transformation, which means complete change? So today we embark on this powerful principle of forgiveness. And as we look at it, as we said last week, we made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. And so this week we explore the spiritual principle of the 8th step, which is forgiveness. And the author, Frederick Buechner, says, when you forgive somebody who has wronged you, you're spared the dismal corrosion of bitterness and wounded pride. For both parties, forgiveness means the freedom again to be at peace inside their own skins and to be glad in each other's presence. So is there anyone in here that may be carrying just a little bit of bitterness around anything that may have ever occurred to you in your life, or perhaps that you have believed you have caused bitterness in another person's life? Because I want you to understand, whether we have experienced or been on the receiving end of an episode or an event or a period of time that caused bitterness in our heart, or whether we believe that our actions or behaviors cause bitterness in the other person's heart, it's the same coin. It's the coin of bitterness. Now, whether we're on the receiving end or on the giving end of it, it's just heads or tails. But it's the same causation, which is bitterness. So we want to look at what will it take to shift any place that we may have bitterness inside of our soul, our heart, our mind, our thought, our feelings, our everyday thoughts that rattle around in our head, because that bitterness is very detrimental not only to our emotional and mental state of being, but to our physical well-being. And I'll cover as we go through this what medical research is now telling us of the connection between the lack of forgiveness or resentment, bitterness, and how it can affect our health. And I'll cover that here in a little bit when I talk about Dr. Mehmet Oz. So Another question is, are you able to easily let slights from other people roll off your back, or do you tend to hold on to them and let them become resentments? For some people carry around anger from as far back as childhood. And I want to say, no kidding. I've made my livelihood on that from Free the Heart Workshop, is that many of us carry anger around from times when we were 3, and we're 67. And we're still mad about that thing that happened to us when we were 3. And so this is the only principle that we know that is active amongst us as human beings, is that what forgiveness is about is allowing us to heal or detach our emotional connection to something that perhaps was causing us bitterness or resentment. That's what forgiveness is about, is freeing us from the emotional connection to something in the past. That's what it's about. And if we are still carrying something with us from the past, that means we're still attached to it. If we're still attached to it, I will guarantee you it is shaping your perception of life. And if that bitterness is what's shaping your perception of life, guess what you may be, or perhaps have a perception of life, is that you're bitter at life. And to the extreme, we're bitter at God, which can explain our hesitancy to pray and meditate, to have a close relationship to God, because we're upset that God did something to us. God didn't save us, didn't save our mom from dying of cancer, didn't save my little baby when it was born as a stillborn. God didn't save it, so we're mad at God. So we're going to look today as, what does it take for us to forgive that also, to forgive God? And we feel that in some way that God, as that old cognitive historical perception of God, the one that sits up in heaven, has done us wrong. So other people wake up with a clean emotional slate every morning. And then there's the vast space in between the two emotional extremes. Those of us that carry bitterness with us every day, and those that wake up in the morning good to go, nothing from the day before bothers them, or the week before, or the month, or the year, or the lifetime before. They're good. But most of us those are the two extremes. Most of us are somewhere in the scale in between those two. True? So it's, where are we in that scale in between? So if you have a little trouble forgiving the major and minor things people do to disappoint you, you're not alone. What those things are, those minor things or major things that people do to us, those are called grudges. So a little 3-question little survey here of you, and you give yourself your own personal honest answer inwardly. Yes or no to this question. There are many people toward whom you harbor resentment towards. There are many people, like more than 2, many. The next one. There are 1 or 2 people in your life that you haven't forgiven. Yes or no? Or the last one, I easily forgive and forget. So who is it in your love, and this is where we want to start with, and looking at and examining, well, where do we want to focus on? Where's the beginning of where we want to make sure that we have forgiven? So if I ask you in your life, you looking back all the way back to your earliest memory, from right here today to your earliest memory, who is there in your life's existence, in your existence here on earth, that you wanted to be loved by? You wanted them to love you, whether it was mom, dad, I don't know who it was for you. You wanted to be loved by, and you needed to be loved, and they've never filled that need that you had to be loved by them. And you're still wounded from it. And you're forgiving, and you haven't forgiven them for being able to love you the way that you wanted to be loved by them. That's an often common one that I've experienced in my years of counseling with a lot of people. That we will carry, oh, Dad just didn't love me the way that I needed to be loved, and we're still upset about it, and Dad's been dead for 40 years. But we're still upset about it. You see, that's that emotional attachment that we keep coming and as we keep dragging with us. And when we keep dragging with us, what that prevents us for, because we bring it right into the forefront of our experience, it prevents us from getting close to another person, from trusting, to opening, to sharing, to exposing our heart and our goodness. Because we're carrying that resentment and that bitterness and that grudge because they didn't love us the way that we needed to be loved by them and thought they should have. Not to take into our conscious thought process that maybe they weren't capable. Maybe they were a turnip. And you weren't about to squeeze any love out of them. But my God, you just can't forgive them for being a turnip. They should have been a beet. So Nelson Mandela, I love this quote, and you've heard some version of it. If you've been in Free the Heart, you hear me say some version of it. It's been taken a lot of times. What many of us do with those resentments, those grudges, those hurts, is what we want to do is we want to hold them inside of us and hang on to them, because that's what our ego tells us to do. Our ego says, play little. Play little, hold on to it. Hold on to it a long time, long time. And what we do is those things start to fester. And we think that by holding on to it, it's keeping us angry at that other person. So we're really getting back at that other person. And what Nelson Mandela says about that behavior is resentment is like drinking poison and then hoping it'll kill your enemies. So I want to make it clear that when we hang on to resentment and we stay stuck in it, the only person that's being harmed by it, make no mistake, your ego, if it wants to argue this, that's your ego again. The only person that's being harmed by it is you. This is one of those black and white truths. Okay? So I want you to look in there. Who have I held that resentment by? Who have I held on for too long? Now here's the one that I share a lot in Free the Heart. And this is the one that sometimes people get real easy or they have a hard time wrapping their mind around it. If you want to know the depth of your personal self-love or self-esteem, it will be directly reflected to the length of time that you have carried a grudge or resentment, a hurt or a pain from the past with you. So when we really love ourselves, we don't want to carry any pain, resentment, grudges inside of us, hurts. We want to start working on it right away from the moment that it happened. The moment. Not hang on to it for any length of time. And the longer we hold on to it is a direct reflection to the length of love that you have for yourself. So is there anyone in there that has carried something for any length of time? Because I want you to understand what we want to start to do, no matter how deep, how intense the original pain is, a traumatic event. I don't care how deep it is. I'm going to give you a couple examples. I promise you no one in this room has gone through anything greater than the examples I'm going to give you. Yes, they're good. The whole nation watched them. And so what I want you to know is that when we carry that stuff, that's what does detriment. And it wears down our insides as well as our own defense system or our, our health, immune system. Thank you. The freedom to be at peace in our own skins, that's what forgiveness allows. We relinquish this freedom when we hold on to our anger and resentment. Enormous amounts of energy are wasted when we hold back our love, when we hold on to hate and harbor acrimonious feelings. The only remedy is letting go and being willing to forgive. Sometimes we need to forgive without reconciliation. Forgiving for the mere purpose of forgiving. Certainly what we strive for is to reconcile all conflicts, clear the air, and understand one another more deeply. But there are times that this is impossible. Perhaps with a parent that has passed away, with someone who has wronged you and is long gone, with someone who is unwilling to communicate with you. These are the times that we must be willing to dig deep into our own souls and see if we're willing to forgive anyway. I've read many times an article written by the scholar and Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel. In 1997, In it, Weisel expresses the most profound act of forgiveness imaginable. It is here that Elie Wiesel expresses forgiveness toward God for the Holocaust. In the article, Wiesel asks God the question he has struggled with all his life. Where were you, God of kindness, in Auschwitz? Wiesel had never been able to understand how a loving God could have allowed the Holocaust to exist. But out of that question, which had tormented him for nearly 50 years, Wiesel gleaned a sudden insight. Watching your children suffer at the hands of your children, haven't you also suffered? In this moment of compassion, Wiesel is finally moved to offer God his forgiveness. Let us make up, Master of Universe. He says, in spite of everything that has happened, yes, in spite, let us make up for the child in me. It is unbearable to be divorced from you for so long. Is there any one of us in here, perhaps, that today is our reconciliation day with God? That we have divorced ourselves from our higher spirit, from the universal consciousness of goodness in this life, believing that it caused something bad to happen to you. We must understand that the universe is neutral, that the principle of life of God is neutral, just like the ocean is neutral. It's hard for us to comprehend something that created 200 billion galaxies as big or bigger than the Milky Way when we talk about God. But if we break it down and use it on a microscopic level and look at the ocean as a perfect metaphor for God, does the ocean ever make anybody sink? Does the ocean ever make anybody swim? No, the answer is because it's neutral. God wasn't causing those to do harm to those in Germany during the World War II. God wasn't causing that. It was our misuse of the law. It was the misuse of the law, which is what we can do all the time. We can get in the ocean and we can drown, the misuse of it. Or we can get in and enjoy by scuba diving, by snorkeling, by fishing, by sailing, by surfing, by body surfing, everything. Who's at choice on how we use the principle of the ocean? Each of us, not the ocean itself. The ocean doesn't lose sleep if we sink or if we swim. And as we grow into that consciousness of understanding that the universal principle of life that we call God, that we call the universe, that we call the one mind is neutral, then we begin to understand, wow, then there is nothing in the universe that is conspiring against me. Because if we believe that something greater than us is conspiring against us every day, why even bother get out of bed? Because what I've learned is that when I hold something good in my heart, when I believe something so great, and when I know that I can achieve and accomplish it, what I find is the universe lines up and conspires for my success. And at either time, does the universe ever go, nope, I'm not doing either one? It just responds to how we want to use it. That's the greatness of understanding this principle. Because we're defeated if we believe something out there greater than us that caused life to be what it is conspiring to work against us. We're done. But if we begin to understand that it's neutral, if we want to drink enough water that it causes us to die, we can, and that water doesn't care. And if we want to drink enough water to replenish ourselves, we can, and the water doesn't lose sleep. We must understand this basic principle of new thought, of metaphysics. In this moment of compassion, Wiesel is finally moved to offer his forgiveness. And in doing so, he finds a greater sense of compassion and realizes that compassion is essential and possible under all circumstances. For the child in all of us, we must learn to forgive. And for the sake of the children, we love with unparalleled ferocity. We must model the most magnanimous and humbling of all acts, the act of forgiveness. As I spoke earlier, more and more evidence is pointing towards the healing power of forgiveness, and the medical community is taking notice. Because as I was watching an interview with Dr. Deepak Chopra, what happens when we hold resentments and anger is what it does is we feel inflamed, right? We feel fired up. We feel like, oh, vital and all right. Well, in a sense, what that does is it creates our blood vessels to become what? Inflamed, as well as our joints, inflammatory. And when we hold that long enough, what they're saying is there are signs that from being inflamed or inflammatory in our joints and vessels can lead to the big C. So that's where Dr. Mehmet Oz, everybody know who Mehmet Oz is? You didn't know who he was until he brought him on Oprah. Till Oprah brought him on. Now he has his own television show. He's all over the radio, public service announcements, everything. And this is what he says around forgiveness. As a doctor, there are a few things that I feel really strongly about, and probably the number one thing I could focus on is this whole issue of forgiveness. Being able to forgive yourself as well as the people around you, and the ability to get past the problems that you're having in your life, and allow yourself to make mistakes and get past those as well is what allows folks to have longevity that they crave. You want to live longer? Don't carry resentments. And here's what he says. When we look around the world at places where people live a long time, we see patterns of humility, which we've already focused on this year, compassion, and forgiveness, endemically found in these societies. It's part of their culture. It's part of what we need, I think, in our nation as well. So how do we do it? How do we turn anger into peace, let go, and forgive? The author, Nancy Gilmartin, author of Healing Conversations, as well as the book The Power of Pause, encourages people to get curious, but not furious. All of us, sooner or later, something somebody did is hurtful, painful, or infuriating to us. And we can't forget it. And we start putting what I call deposits in our resentment bank account. Sometimes we don't know we're even doing it. What if we could stop and rethink? What did I stuff somewhere, and can I take it out and look at it a little differently? And maybe there was something going on that day for me or for the other person that I didn't know about at the time. And maybe we can begin to breathe some compassion or some understanding for what we couldn't possibly know or see at that time. So yes, there is a new way to begin to look at it, and maybe you can't let it go right now. But you can then begin to soften that hard knot on the inside and give yourself a choice. Do I want to carry this around for the rest of my life? Do I want to carry this around for the rest of my life? Got a story for you. A frog goes into a bank and approaches the teller. He can see from her nameplate that her name is Patricia Wack. Miss Wack, I'd like to get a $30,000 loan to take a holiday with. Patty looks at the frog in disbelief and asks his name. The frog says his name is Kermit Jagger. His dad is Mick Jagger. And that's okay, that he knows the bank manager. Patty explains that he'll need to secure the loan with some collateral. The frog says, sure, I have this, and produces a tiny porcelain elephant about 1 inch tall, bright pink, and perfectly formed. Very confused, Patty explains that she'll have to consult with the bank manager, and then disappears into a bank office. She finds the manager and says, there's a frog called Kermit Jagger out there who claims to know you and wants to borrow $30,000. And he wants to use this little pink elephant as a collateral. And with that, she holds it up. I mean, she says to the bank manager, what in the world is this? The bank manager looks back at her and says, it's a knick-knack, Patty Wack. Give the frog a loan. His old man's a rolling stone. You have no idea how many times I said that one to myself. It's a knick-knack, paddywhack, give the frog alone. His old man's a rolling stone. So one of the people that I admire as many of the last 100 years is Carl Jung. I've studied his work, used much of it. I love this reading as it applies very easily and effortlessly to that stuff that we carry inside of us. There is no light without shadow and no psychic wholeness without imperfection. To round itself out, life calls not for perfection, but for completeness. And for this, the thorn in the flesh is needed. What are your thorns in your flesh? They are needed to grow you spiritually. The suffering of defects without which there is no progress and no ascent. These are what allow us to ascend in great ways. And sometimes they come on in ways that we cannot fathom. 5 years ago, in about a month or 6 weeks, there was a huge demonstration and a unbelievable example to not only North America but to the rest of the world of what true forgiveness really means and what it looks like in action. I want to remind you of the shooting that occurred 5 years ago in the Amish village in Pennsylvania.
The Amish don't teach their children about forgiveness in a formal way. They don't have a curriculum on forgiveness. Amish children see their parents forgiving or extending forgiveness, and that's how they learn. The Lord's Prayer is one of the first things that an Amish child memorizes and learns to recite. They hear Jesus saying, "Forgive 70 times 7." And one Amishman said to me, that would mean if there's 490 victims, we keep on forgiving.
But on October 2nd, 2006, in Pennsylvania's Lancaster County, a 32-year-old milk driver named Charles Roberts was about to put the Amish belief in forgiveness to the ultimate test. In a tiny schoolhouse in Nickel Mines, Roberts, who had been troubled by his own past, opened fire, killing 5 Amish girls and wounding 5 others.
The Amish have a profound ability to absorb adversity. They have a strong sense of yieldedness to God, a sense of acceptance of whatever comes, to not argue with God, to not debate or fight with God, to not get angry at God.
So I want to take you into that story and read to you an excerpt from an article that was written by the authors of the book called Amish Grace. And this is what the authors said about the incident. Scapegoating may be irrational, but it's understandable and also very common. Perhaps that's why in the upcoming movie on the Nickel Mines Amish school shooting adopts that storyline. The movie's trailer portrays an Amish mother showing up at the deceased gunman's home the day after the shooting to confront his devastated wife, holding her responsible for her husband's deeds. Only it didn't happen that way. True, Amish people did show up at gunman Charles Roberts' home within hours of the shooting that left 5 girls dead. They also visited his parents and parents-in-law, all of whom lived within a few miles of the West Nichols Mine School. But the Amish people didn't go there to express rage or to sling blame. They visited the Roberts family because of their compassion for his kin, victims of the tragedy who were also suffering immense emotional pain. One Amish neighbor consoled Charles Roberts, the shooter's father, with a hand on his shoulder and 4 simple words: "We love you, Roberts." A few days later at Roberts' burial, parents of some of the Amish girls that had been killed showed up and hugged his widow. It was, said one Amish man, simply the right thing to do. In the Lifetime movie, which takes its title from our book, the authors wrote, "We suspect the movie will conclude with the enraged Amish mother somehow finding within herself the wherewithal to forgive. It's the kind of ending that will make television viewers feel good, because it mirrors the way many of us think about ourselves. We'd be angry as hell at first, but over time, our rage would subside. Eventually, our reasonable and forgiving side, our good side, would win out. That may be the way we think about ourselves, but at Nickel Mines, the Amish reversed that pattern. Listen to these words. They led with their forgiving side. They didn't come out angry. They didn't come out vengeful. They didn't come out violent. Imagine if George W. Bush could have practiced that on 2001. And begin the struggle to make sense of their pain by extending grace. Relying on deeply ingrained habits of forgiveness, they extended compassion right away, within hours of the shooting. Not months, not years, within hours. Did it make any difference that the Amish reacted that way from the start? Terry Roberts, the mother of the gunman, thinks so. In our newly released paperback edition of Amish Grace, we include an interview with Mrs. Roberts. In it, she tells us how the Amish community reached out to her and her kin in the aftermath of the tragedy. "It is hard to say how I may have reacted had they not offered forgiveness," says Miss Roberts. "I just know that their immediate expression had a tremendous impact on my husband and myself." The Amish response was the beginning of the healing process, Miss Roberts continues. She describes how it compelled her and her husband to visit all the Amish families whose daughters had been shot, and to invite all the mothers and the surviving girls to her home for tea. Miss Roberts today continues to host those teas and swimming parties for the surviving girls, 4 of whom had resumed relatively normal lives. Her closest relationship, however, exists with Rosanna, the one survivor who doesn't swim because she's seriously disabled. To this day, Miss Roberts visits with Rosanna for several hours every Thursday evening. Perhaps the real story of Amish Grace is as touching as the Lifetime movie version of it. But as we note in our book, the story of Amish forgiveness is not about remarkable individuals finding within themselves the ability to forgive. It's about a community that valued forgiveness and reconciliation so highly before the shooting happened that scapegoating the Roberts family on October 2nd, 2006 wasn't even thinkable. If you want to be a forgiving person, writes Yale theologian Miroslav Volf, it helps to live in a community that celebrates forgiveness. That won't make forgiveness easy, he says, but it will make it easier. So to conclude today, from Martin Luther King, forgiveness is not an occasional act. It is a permanent attitude. The only way children can learn the habit of forgiveness is by seeing us, their parents, forgive others and forgive ourselves. We are always role modeling to those that will come after us. Now, I want you to know there is nothing that you have ever done to another person or to yourself or another person has ever done to you that cannot be forgiven. May we always remember the powerful statement of the Amish community of being able to forgive immediately within hours of the devastation of having 5 of their children lost to a horrible act of hate or anger. But within hours. So today, within hours of leaving here, who is it on your list that needs to be forgiven? Who do you need to be forgiven by? It can be as simple as, "Dear, I want to be forgiven for," or "Dear, I forgive you for," and writing that letter out. You don't have to hand it to them for the healing to occur, but you read that letter until there's no emotional tie to it any longer. And you set it aside for a week or two, and you come back and read it again, and if there's still an emotional tie, it needs to be read some more. If it feels as if you're done, then it's time to release the letter, which could be simply burning, destroying in some way. So who in your life do we need to forgive or be forgiven by? Let us pray.